o'clock here, so we will get started. So again, I want to welcome everybody. I'm Jason Scores to our Ocean and Coastal Resource Management Speaker Series. We have two alum from the Middlebury Institute, two alumni who we're really happy to have here today to talk about Arctic policy and kind of Alaskan land management. We have Sorina Stalla, who's going to be starting off, and then we have Megan Hillgartner, and both, again, were students a few years back and made their careers up in Alaska and really loved it up there, and I think are going to share some really unique perspectives because they've been working at the intersection of a lot of interesting agencies and Indigenous rights and, you know, some big land use stuff going on in Alaska. You've probably seen in the news. They're trying to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the Tongass National Forest. So I'm not sure if those issues will enter into this discussion, but certainly we can maybe touch on those. And again, I know a lot of people are missing the debates. You're going to get a lot more science, a lot more knowledge, and a lot more truth listening to these two awesome women than you would on the debate. So without further ado, Sorina, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And thanks everybody for missing the debate to come talk with us today. So like Jason said, I'm going to start out and talk to you about the work I do with the Interagency Arctic Research and Policy Committee. But first, I'm just going to take a minute to tell you a little bit about how Megan and I got to Alaska and how we kind of got to where we are now. So I think, like Jason said, Megan and I both graduated from MIS in 2017. And we spent our last semester doing the IPSS program. And we did that up in Fairbanks, Alaska, with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And our IPSS project, which was collaborative, was looking mostly at food security, co-management of marine mammals, and partnerships surrounding natural resource management in Alaska. So we worked together for that awesome 6 months. And then we continued to work together for about 2 more years on different contracts to NOAA. And our work with NOAA was very similar. It was very centered around partnerships surrounding improving natural resource management in Alaska. But that's what brought us to Juneau, Alaska. So for 2 years, we were working together on that. And since then, we've moved on to work separately, which is sad, but that pathway from MIS to IPSS to Fairbanks to Juneau, and that work we did together on natural resource management and partnership really paved the way for where each of us are now, even though we're doing very different things. That was really a defining pathway for both of us. So I'm going to start today, like I said, talking a little bit about my work with the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, which I'll call IARPC from now on, and the work that they do and we all do together to improve collaboration and coordination in Arctic research. And I'm going to touch on a few different elements of IARPC to illustrate some of the processes behind one way that federal Arctic research gets coordinated and prioritized, and how these different federal agencies that have investments in the Arctic and are invested in Arctic research come together to collaborate and advance research. So I'll briefly give an overview. Yep.
So sorry, can I jump in? We forgot to introduce our interpreters and to let people know that live interpretation's available tonight. Elizabeth, do you mind to unmute and just tell the attendees?
Sorry about that, Serena. That was my bad.
Yeah, I forgot to.
Okay.
Oh, sure. It's no problem at all. I just sent a quick note to the chat about that. So we do have interpretation in 2 languages available for this event. The Portuguese channel is in fact our second Chinese booth. So we have interpretation available in both Chinese and German. If you look at the central toolbar at the bottom of your screen, there should be an option where you can select interpretation languages if that would be helpful to you. So thanks so much.
Great, thank you. And sorry, Serena, to jump in.
No, that's fine. That's very, very cool that you're interpreting. Okay, yeah, so I'll briefly give an overview on what IARPC is and sort of how it came to be and how it operates, because that's sort of important to understand for going into how it functions and works to coordinate Arctic research. And then I'm going to talk about one of its key mandates, which is drafting and implementing the Arctic Research Plan every 5 years. So I'll talk a little bit about the one that we're currently implementing, as well as the development of this next Arctic Research Plan, which is where I sort of engaged with IARPC, which will take effect if it is approved in 2022. So IARPC is a committee under the executive branch of the government, and it consists of what are called principals or representatives from 14 different agencies, departments, and offices from across the federal government. It's chaired by the National Science Foundation, and its main charge is enhancing the scientific monitoring and research on local, regional, and global environmental issues in the Arctic. IARPC was established in 1984 by the Arctic Research and Policy Act. And this act actually created two entities. They created IARPC as well as the Arctic Research Commission, or the United States Arctic Research Commission. And basically this law requires that IARPC and the commission work together to promote Arctic research and recommend Arctic research policy and develop this 5-year Arctic research plan to implement that policy. So IARPC existed prior to 2010 since its establishment, but in 2010, President Obama issued a presidential memo that established IARPC as an interagency working group of the National Science and Technology Council, their Committee on the Environment, which is under the Office of Science and Technology Policy of the executive branch. And that move really did a bunch of things that I won't go into, but it gave IARPC more stance, more power, more ability to kind of work and mobilize policy. So IARPC basically now operates under the guidelines established by the National Science and Technology Council for an interagency working group, and reports directly to the Committee on the Environment. And like I said, IARPC is chaired by the National Science Foundation, and the executive director of IARPC is also the assistant director of polar science at the White House, OSTP. So I'm almost done with the background, so we can get into the more interesting stuff. But IARPC has sort of two components that are important to understand. And one is federal only, and the other is open to the public and different stakeholders. So the part of IARPC that is federal only basically just responds to the needs of federal agencies. So these are there are these 14 principals or representatives from the 14 different agencies that work in the Arctic, and another group called staff group, which includes program managers from these different 14 agencies. And basically staff group works as an unofficial body to respond to the needs of these 14 principals and complete IARPC's day-to-day work. And one of their main tasks, which will be important to understand later, is to organize, coordinate the development and implementation of the Arctic Research Plan, which I'll get to in the next slide. But then the other part of IARPC, which is really where a lot of the work happens, is called IARPC Collaborations. And IARPC Collaborations it's the open side, so it's open to anyone who's interested in participating. So when I was at MISS, I signed up for a IARPC Collaborations account, and that's how I learned a lot about what was going on in the Arctic, and could sort of see what research was happening and meet people. So I encourage anybody who is interested to sign up for an account. But IARPC Collaborations really encourages multidisciplinary discussions and collaboration across different sectors to improve Arctic research. And most of the activity that happens within IARPC Collaborations is done via collaboration teams. So all this background is really meant to set up talking about the Arctic Research Plan. So at the core of really what IARPC is about is something called the Arctic Research Plan. So by law, the same law that established IARPC, IARPC has to develop and implement an Arctic Research Plan every 5 years. And this plan gets developed by IARPC, but in consultation with the Arctic Research Commission, as well as the governor of the state of Alaska, Arctic residents, the private sector, and other public interest groups. And the Arctic Research Plan is not, the purpose of the plan is not to sort of detail and encompass every single piece of research that happens in the Arctic, but really to identify and address key topics where an interagency approach is most likely to accelerate progress in research. So the plan works to identify really critical areas where the US research enterprise supports US policy, looking at like small community scale up to global scales, and look for key areas where federal investment can really be enhanced through collaboration. So we are currently implementing the 2017 to 2020-21 Arctic Research Plan. And at the same time, we are in the process of developing the next one, which I'll talk about the process of developing that a little bit at the end, but will go into effect in January 2022. So a little bit about the plan that we're implementing now, because the current plan structure is a little bit unclear still. But the plan is essentially rooted in 4 main policy drivers, which are these critical areas where research supports policy. And within these 4 policy drivers, which are really the overarching themes of the plan, are 9 research goals, which are sort of broad topics that identify where an interagency approach can accelerate progress. And these goals need to connect and respond to at least 2 of the policy drivers. And then under research goals are objectives, which are specific challenge areas that address the research goals. And then within that are performance elements, which are very specific tasks that have concrete and measurable outcomes. So they are really what, like the performance elements in the current plan is how like Congress and the principals, these federal agencies monitor how well the plan is being implemented and how well the policy drivers are being supported. So in the current plan, like I said, there's 4 main policy drivers, and they are to do with enhancing the well-being of Arctic residents. So we just call this one well-being, but it really tries to work and identify knowledge that will inform local, state, and national policies that address a range of goals, including health, economic development, and cultural vibrancy of Indigenous peoples and other Arctic residents. The second policy driver is to advance stewardship of the Arctic environment. So research to provide knowledge to understand the functioning of terrestrial, marine, freshwater ecosystems, and also anticipate a lot of the changes that are happening in the Arctic and evaluate the potential impact of these changes, as well as the impact of local actions on sort of global systems. The third policy driver is to strengthen national and regional security. So looking at ways to improve prediction capabilities, projections into the future to ensure that emergency response agencies have the information they need to function in the Arctic, especially as it's changing, and operate safely and effectively in the Arctic over both in the short term and long term. And then finally, the last policy driver is a little bit more broad, and it's to improve the understanding of the Arctic as a component of planet Earth. So these are really the 4 main policy drivers these are the 4 main policy drivers in the current plan, to which all research should sort of feed into and support. So within this, like I said, there's 9 research goals that these 14 federal agencies have decided are like the main research goals that we should be focusing on right now. And I don't think I'll actually read them all out because they're kind of long, but they have to do with understanding health and improving well-being, just sort of similar to that policy driver, advancing the process and system understanding of the atmosphere, looking at sea ice specifically around improving predictions of sea ice cover, increasing the understanding and function of marine ecosystems, and especially as things are changing very quickly, trying to look at the changes that are, what the cascading impacts of that are going to be. Understanding, looking at glaciers, ice caps, and the Greenland ice sheet and how that relates to sea level rise, looking at permafrost control dynamics, advancing integrated and landscape scale understanding of Arctic terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, and again, like what's going to happen with all the changes occurring, strengthening community resilience, and enhancing frameworks
You
for
should be able to
environmental
see the notes with that
intelligence. So that's a little, that's more to do with sort of supporting a lot of decision making, and yeah. So I think, yeah, I won't go into performance elements too much, but just as an example of a performance element to show you kind of the different layers of specificity. A performance element under, for example, the marine ecosystems goal would be something like increased knowledge on the distribution and abundance of Arctic marine species across all trophic levels and scales, including an improved understanding on the formation and maintenance of biological hotspots and proximate causes of shifts in range. So this is much more of like a very specific task that agencies can attach themselves to, and then work together to address. And again, these are important to understand because this is how, again, Congress and the principles track implementation and how well people are doing, or the agencies are doing in implementing. So IARPC collaborations, which is the non-federal side of IARPC, is the primary channel for implementing the plan. And this essentially happens through collaboration teams. So for each goal, there is a collaboration team, and the collaboration team is led by someone from a federal agency. And these teams meet about once a month to make progress on the research goal, again, which is done by performance elements. And then every year, an annual progress report is released in October, and then a biannual report is submitted to Congress every other year. So this is, again, how the staff group and principals assess how well IARPC is doing in addressing the research goals and objectives, and how well research is supporting policy via IARPC. So some examples of the impact and of the kind of work and progress that is made by IARPC and implementing the plan. I have two examples before I very quickly touch on the new plan and turn it over to Megan. But one example is a series of research cruises that happened in 2018 and 2019 that were led by the Environmental Intelligence Collaboration Team. So these this team facilitated a couple research cruises in the Bering and Chukchi Seas to enhance harmful algal bloom research and conduct more sampling activities. So this effort led to more seed funding from the Alaska Ocean Observing System, the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Team to continue to collect water and samples for harmful algal bloom detection, and then to host a big workshop in Nome, which is in Northwest Alaska, that started to really focus in on a lot of the potential public health risks that are associated with harmful algal blooms. So this community sampling effort was essentially the beginning of an essential baseline understanding of harmful algal blooms in the Bering Strait region. And it also addressed the need for more information on testing of natural resources and subsistence food for toxins, which are very detrimental to like human health, especially where there's a lot of subsistence hunting and wild food consumption still. So this follow-up information was shared with communities, with other entities, and it is still continuing now, but is primarily focused on connecting researchers in the Bering Sea with each other and helping bring together and synthesize knowledge from research and get that research to communities so they have a very up-to-date understanding of like food that they might be hunting that might be harmful to their health. And then a second example from the an effort undertaken by the Health and Wellbeing Collaboration Team. They advance several initiatives to improve Alaska Indigenous mental health, including creating a new toolkit called Rising Sun, which is reducing the incidence of suicide in Indigenous groups, strengths through United Networks. And that activity actually came out of the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which ended in 2017. And this team really highlighted the work of the Alaska Native Collaboration Hub for Research on Resilience, which conducts a lot of resilience-focused research aimed at increasing community health by strategically strengthening local institutions, programs, enhancing cultural practices that protect youth from suicide and suicide-related risks. So this project really works to integrate community needs and is now, that it's been established, is driven, supported, and led by communities and really seeks to understand strength-based approaches at the community level. So before I wrap up, and I don't know if we're doing questions after or, yeah, but I want to just touch on the development of what we're doing now, the development of the next Arctic research plan. So like I said, IARPC is simultaneously implementing and developing the next Arctic research plan, which will go into effect in January 2022. This process is a pretty long one. It's about a little bit over 2 years. And it started at the end of 2019, in October 2019, or September 2019. And it starts with a formal approval to begin the plan development process. And then IARPC comes together to develop an engagement strategy for engaging all the different agencies, as well as all the sectors. So the governor of the state of Alaska and all the other entities that need to be involved throughout this 2 years. And then they identify a steering group that will sort of help to advise the process. And this whole phase lasts about 6 months. And then the next phase is the development phase, and this is where a lot of the engagement happens. So I was brought on at the beginning of this phase, and there's a lot of different things that happen here. One is a formal federal register notice goes out that is a request for input on what people think the most pressing Arctic research needs are and how the plan can present these in a way that in which they can sort of be achieved. And then a lot of other engagement happens, like listening sessions, webinars. We just had a multi-day workshop that brought together over 100 people from different sectors to decide on what the sort of 5 main priority research areas should be for the next plan. And then so we have those 5 recommendations, and the next step is the drafting phase, where the IARPC principals will give them these recommendations. They will hopefully approve them, and federal drafting teams are put together who will each write a chapter on these priority areas. And then finally, we get to public review, where we will publish publicly on the Federal Register notice a draft of the plan. There'll be a few months comment period. We will incorporate these comments, and then it goes into interagency reviews, and then to OSTP in the White House, which is a little bit of a I'm not sure about the process once it gets there. It's a little bit of a black box, but hopefully everything happens as it should. It gets approved and released, and then we start to implement that new plan in 2022. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions now, or if Megan's going to go, and we can answer questions at the end, whatever works.
I'm thinking maybe let's have Megan go and maybe kind of combine the Q&A at the end. I think that would probably be best. So thanks a lot, Sorina.
Yep.
Sure, that was great, Sorina. It was really interesting to hear about a little bit more about the work you're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, let's make sure I get this. And from beginning. All right, so bear with me 1 second. All right. Are you guys seeing all my notes, or are you just seeing the presentation?
Just presentation.
Okay, good, because my notes make me look crazy, but I realize I'm just, I process things through writing, so. Okay, anyways, thank you again, everybody. So again, my name is Megan Hillgartner, and I work as a natural resource specialist for the Department of Natural Resources, or DNR for short. DNR manages all state-owned land and water and natural resources except for fish and game on behalf of the people of Alaska. There are 7 divisions within my department. We have different divisions that reflect our major programs, and those include the Division of Forestry, Agriculture, Geophysical Surveys and Geological Surveys. We have a Division of Oil and Gas and Parks and Outdoor Recreation and Support Services. And then lastly, we have the division I work for, which is the Division of Mining, Land, and Water. More specifically, I work within the land section. Mining and water are a little bit separate, but I'm based out of the Southeast Regional Office, and that's located in Juneau. So in this presentation, I'm just going to give an overview of who we are and what we do, how we manage state land. So I'll go over DMLW's mission, and I'll talk about some of the authorities that we operate under. And then I'll talk a bit about land use authorizations, which are the decision tools we use to manage state land. And then I'll talk about why we conduct public notice and agency review. And lastly, I'll wrap up. I'll just go over some of the challenges that I've experienced. I've been working in this role as a natural resource specialist and adjudicator for a little bit over a year right now, and so I'm still learning a lot. But I feel like I've definitely come across some challenges as well that I think you guys would be interested in hearing about. So who are we? We at the Department of Natural Resources, Division of Mining, Land, and Water, are the primary manager of Alaska's land holdings. So our responsibilities include ensuring the state's land title. We classify land, which is assessing the different resources within a specific area and designating a management intent for that area. And we also are in charge of all leasing and permitting of state land for recreational or commercial uses. My department differs from a lot of other state agencies in that we work with a broad range of users and uses and resources. We're not, fish and game that just works with fish and game. We have a lot of different aspects to manage, which makes our job challenging, but it helps us keep in mind this intent to manage land for multiple uses in our mind on a daily basis. So for those of you that don't know, Alaska is a massive state. It is 1/5 the size of the continental United States, which is larger than Texas, California, and Montana all combined. So this is a lot of land. So who owns this land and who manages what? So this pie chart in the upper left-hand corner you see gives kind of a breakdown of land ownership. And you'll see that the vast majority, over 63%, this green portion, is all managed by the federal government. That equates to about 230 million acres of land, give or take. It's not reflected very well in this map of Alaska. I think it's not just the green you see here, but also these beige and tan portions. That's all federal land. 27% of the land is state-owned, and that's this blue piece of the pie. And the remaining 12%, that is all classified as private land, which is predominantly land that is owned and managed by the Alaska Native corporations, 13 regional Alaska Native corporations. Land in private ownership other than the Alaska Native corporations comprises less than 1% of the total land in Alaska. So overall, the state, of that 27% of land that we manage, that equates to about 94 million acres of upland and about 60 million acres of tideland and shoreland, and what we refer to as submerged land, which is land that begins at the mean high water mark and extends out seaward about 3 nautical miles off into the ocean. So the state's still waiting on a couple of land conveyances from the federal government, but once those are completed, we'll have approximately 165 million acres of upland and tideland to own and manage. I wanted to show you guys this map because this is just a regional boundary map. I apologize for the kind of blurry and pixelated quality of this, but I really just wanted to show you guys how the Department of Natural Resources breaks down management of our land into regions. So these regions are specific only to DNR. Other agencies, this doesn't represent the boundaries for other agencies or borough boundaries or anything like that. But really it just shows that we have three main areas, three regions. So the Southeast region, which is this green portion down here, is the office I'm based out of in Juneau. We manage everything that's green. The South Central region is, their office is based in Anchorage, and they manage all land that's in this orange portion down here. And the Northern region, the office of which is based in Fairbanks, addresses all state land within this blue portion. And as you might imagine, there's pretty substantial regional differences here in not only land ownership, but in ecosystems and climate, native cultures, and so on. And so really the issues and the decisions regarding land management are pretty diverse throughout the regions and really nuanced. So the Northern region will manage a lot of really remote areas with sparse populations and just large swaths of land, whereas SCRO, which is the South Central region, that's where most of our population is. So a lot of the authorizations they work on typically address things like utilities, communications, access. And then in the Southeast, where I work, most of the uplands here are federally owned. We have the Tongass National Forest and the Chugach National Forest. And so a lot of our authorizations and a lot of work I do is primarily related to tideland and submerged land. So looking at things, authorizations that relate to private float homes or docks or anchoring mooring buoys and that sort of thing. So what's our mission? The mission of the Division of Mining, Land and Water is to provide for the appropriate use and management of Alaska's state-owned land and water, aiming toward maximum use consistent with the public interest. So our mission is derived from the Alaska State Constitution, more specifically Article 8, which addresses natural resources. And this is a really special article, considering that it was really kind of one of the first of its kind and was a unique product of the 1956 convention, because many other states at the time, their state constitutions did not have specific articles or references to natural resource policy, which I thought was kind of interesting. I just learned this the other week. But this quote that we see down here, this is the statement of policy, which is found, it's section 1 of Article 8. And it reads, "It is the policy of the state to encourage the settlement of its land and the development of its resources by making them available for use consistent with the public interest." So this obviously is a really rather emphatic statement that the policy of the state is to encourage the development of its land and resources, but in a manner that recognizes the collective interests of the people of Alaska as the owners of those lands and resources. But what does it mean to manage resources consistent with the public interest? Well, that means that resources, yes, they need to be utilized, developed, and conserved for the maximum benefit of the people. That to do so, the principles of conservation need to govern resource management. Everyone needs to be treated equally by management rules, and that the public needs to be notified of all disposals of public land and resources. And I'm just showing this slide because there were two key people that were really influential in shaping the state's policy on natural resource management, and that was Bob Bartlett and Vincent Ostrom, who is none other than the husband of Eleanor Ostrom, who I'm sure you all have learned about or shortly will learn about. So Bob Bartlett was Alaska's territorial delegate to Congress, and in his keynote address to the Constitutional Convention, in a speech titled "Meeting the Challenge," he really used that opportunity to showcase the significance of natural resource management in Alaska, going on to state that 50 years from now, the people of Alaska aren't going to judge the convention on the decisions taken upon issues like local government, but rather the decisions taken upon the vital issue of resource policy. By this time, Alaska had already experienced exploitation on a pretty grand scale. There was deep history with the boom and bust communities of the gold rush and the salmon canning industry. And these really illustrated the dangers associated with exploitative mineral development or extractive industries when there are no considerations for the land or for the people or for the future of the state. And so Bob said that, yes, development is important and it's going to be something that people are eagerly looking toward if we become a state, but it can't be confused with exploitation. And that the well-being of the state is going to, and the well-being of the present and future citizens are going to be dependent on the wise administration and oversight of these activities. Vincent Ostrom was another key figure, and among his many accomplishments that I'm sure you guys are aware of, he also helped draft Article 8 on natural resources for the Alaska Constitution. And what he did was he helped enshrine the idea that it's the people of Alaska rather than the government who would own the state's natural resources. So you'll see a lot, I'll say a lot throughout this presentation that the people of Alaska own these resources, and we're making decisions that are in the best interest of the state or the people of Alaska as the owners of those resources. So how do we do this? Our Constitution really clearly directs us to encourage the use of its land and resources. It's public domain land. It's, we're stated that it's to be utilized, but it's also my job and our job at DNR as land managers to act as stewards of the land. So we need to consider multiple user groups. We need to consider their uses. We need to consider the impacts that they have. And we need to consider the potential future use of the land and how all of these activities or requests to use land are in the best interest of the state and the people of Alaska. Managing multiple use on state land, it's a major balancing act, but we work to achieve this through our adjudication process and our land use authorization process. And this helps us achieve or work to achieve this balancing act by setting conditions on the activity that's occurring on state land. And so before I go into the different types of authorization tools we use, I'm just going to talk briefly about what sort of activities do not require an authorization from the Department of Natural Resources. And these are activities or uses that we refer to as generally allowed uses, or GAU for short. So it's a lot of what you would assume would not require an authorization. You don't need a permit from us to go hiking or backpacking or skiing on state land. You can harvest berries and mushrooms for personal use. You can access a trail and ride a horse, or even go travel by dog sled. That's all fine. But when those activities increase their threshold, when the impacts start becoming more serious or long-term, that's when you'll need to get an authorization from us for that activity. And so when someone makes a request to use state land, we have really a wide variety of different authorization tools we use to make a decision about that requested use. But I'll just talk about the three main ones we use, which are permits, easements, and leases. And we'll often discuss amongst ourselves, I'll get an application for a permit, but I'll review the activity and think, no, this is much more substantial use of state land. It really needs to be a lease, so we can set some more stipulations and controls on the activity. But in general, permits authorize a specific activity in a specific area. Usually they are for more short-term, so 5 years or less, activities that are really temporary, non-permanent improvements. So an example would be this floating dock you see down here in this bottom photo. That's an example of something that we would permit. It's easy to remove, it's low impact. An easement is, for those of you that don't know what an easement is, that's just a non-possessory interest in land that entitles the holder of that easement to use the land in a specified manner. And so easements are generally provided as grants of access through an area. So for structures that are linear in nature, so roads or bridges or trails, or for installation maintenance of other improvements like utility lines or power lines, we'll authorize those through easements. And then lastly, we do leases, which are they grant the lessee the right to exclusively use real property for a specific term, generally no longer than 25 years. That's kind of our max, in exchange for periodic payment. And when we issue a lease, it's usually for an activity that is in the support of the development of state's resources. So for log transfer facilities or for port facility docks and that sort of thing. So where do we get our authority to do this? Well, our authorities come from the Alaska Constitution, Article 8 that I mentioned, and from state statutes. So we follow Title 38, which is Chapter 5 of the Alaska Land Act, which provides us with the different authorities and guidance for our work as land managers to make these decisions permitting the sale or lease or disposal of land. We also use the Alaska Administrative Code, Title 11, which are specific regulations that provide additional guidance for us in directing us on how we manage land. And then lastly, we use these documents called area plans or area management plans. And area management plans are a really important part of the work that I do. I feel like I'm a professional researcher at times because a lot of the time of what I'm doing is spent combing through these resource plans. So it's part of our policy, DNR policy, that any decision we make about the use of state land has to be consistent with the area plan provision. So the area plans are the adopted legally binding policy for the management of state land and resources. And the 4 documents you see up here, these are just a couple of examples of some of the plans that I use frequently in the Southeast region. They are really large and really detailed. And what they do is they describe all the resources within an area. They identify all the landowners within that area. They describe traditional uses, subsistence uses, and resources, and then it sets a classification for the area. For example, this land within a specific tract might be designated or classified as harvest land. It's land that's rich with a lot of resources, and it helps us assign a management intent for that area. So we have to use these when we adjudicate an authorization, and they help us direct our permitting and our leasing. So whenever we receive a request to use state land, we have to conduct public notice. It's probably the most important part of the authorization process and most important part of my job. And we do public notice not only because it is constitutionally required of us, we have to do it, but also because it is a means for us to provide some transparency to the public about the requested activity. It helps ensure a fair administrative process, and it's really important for us because it helps us make better decisions about a use of state land, because we're getting the best information from local people and from different entities, cities, tribes and villages, federal agencies. It is really, really important. So I spend a lot of time before I notice an application or a decision, writing out exactly where the activity is happening, who might be affected by it, and I notice any third parties, anyone who could be impacted by the use. It's a very important part. We also conduct an agency review, which agency review serves a very similar purpose to public notice, except for instead of informing the public, general public and federal agencies about the potential use of state land, we look specifically to other state agencies to provide expertise on how to manage land. So I send all of our applications typically get sent to Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Fish and Game. I work really closely with those agencies very frequently. And this is important because their comments have a huge impact on our decisions. They help us decide what sort of deliverables we require from an applicant. Sometimes we won't authorize a certain land use until the person applying for that land use gets a different permit that they need from DEC. And it helps, also agency comments help us set stipulations that we might include in the authorization. So if Fish and Game says the activity is fine, but they have, there's some concerns about, the potential for tracked equipment to run through some streams. We'll say we'll authorize this activity, but we're not going to allow the use of any wheeled equipment to travel through the area. So it helps us set controls so we can make sure we're minimizing harm and degradation to state land and resources. And so we summarize and justify all of our decisions as to whether or not we're going to issue an activity and authorize an activity on state land through a written decision document, which we also refer to as best interest findings. And here's an example of one I just did the other day. This one's for the Forest Service. They applied for an easement. They wanted to construct some improvements for developing a recreational area. So they wanted to develop a hiking trail and a couple of off-highway ATV trails. And these are, we have to do this for one of these, written decisions for every single authorization that we do. And they're really long, they're really detailed. Mine typically average anywhere between 10 and 20 pages long, but they cover multiple aspects of the prospective authorization, everything ranging from where it's specifically located to the authorities that we're adjudicating the use under. We'll discuss the environmental impacts, we'll discuss the economic benefits, and then we also discuss any third-party interests in the area and some of the traditional uses of the area. And we also are sure to include all comments that we receive during the public notice period and the agency review period. And we have to respond to all of those comments as well. And the reason that we write these best interest findings is because they help capture our evaluation and our thought process, and they provide accountability and transparency not only for us but for the applicant and for the general public. And they also provide an opportunity for appeals. If someone disagrees with the decision that I make, we provide the opportunity for them to appeal it, and we'll reevaluate and review that decision. And so it's a really important part of my job as well is writing these best interest findings. So I think overall, we have a pretty thorough and well-rounded process for making land management decisions, though it's not, of course, without its challenges. And so these are just a couple of things that I've come across that has been a little bit difficult in the work that I've been doing. So one of the things is if there's not a specific statute or regulation, we, being the natural resource specialist or adjudicator, we often have a lot of discretion in terms of the authorization, which can be really challenging. So if we're not mandated specifically by a statute or regulation, I have to make a lot of decisions. For example, who do I need to publicly notice in this situation? How long does the notice need to be? How detailed does my written decision need to be? These sort of questions come up a lot. And another thing is, I think our organization is always trying to find the right middle ground between the clarity of a specified written requirement and the flexibility of more general guidelines. So an example I'll give you, this photo you see here on the left. This photo was taken from a recent site visit to a local area I went to here in Juneau, this area called Montana Creek. According to state regulations, it's a generally allowed use to operate ATV vehicles, all-terrain vehicles on state land. However, within that, there's specific language that says ATV use on state land is a generally allowed use, meaning that it doesn't require a permit, provided that the activity does not contribute to significant rutting or degradation to land or water quality. So I look at this photo and I see significant rutting. I see significant degradation to the land. I don't think the activity qualifies as a generally allowed use, and I think it needs to be permitted. But someone else, another adjudicator, could look at this and say, oh, I think it's fine. I don't think that's significant at all. And so sometimes within, when working with this kind of stuff, there's a lot of gray area in between the statutes and regulations, which makes decision-making pretty challenging at times. Another challenge that we face is monitoring compliance and enforcement. Managing, unchecked multiple use management has a lot of consequences and impacts, and it's really difficult for us to make sure that a permittee is operating within the bounds of their permit and is not violating any aspect of their permit. It's really important to do that to make sure we're maintaining order on state land. So for example, I don't know how old this photo is, but it looks, I think one of our adjudicators issued a lease for this person to have a float home, float home on this dock. But you'll notice in this photo, there are all these barrels tipped over, and we generally never allow the storage of fuel or hazardous materials on state land, especially if it's on or adjacent to the water. That's just a big no-no. But we see here that this person has multiple fuel drums that aren't properly stored. They're tipped over. They could be leaking. They could be contaminating the site. And so monitoring and following up and making sure that people are in compliance within the bounds of their permit and following all the stipulations of their permit or authorization is really challenging, especially in COVID times when we can't necessarily travel to all the sites that we'd like to travel to. And enforcement is difficult. We're not an enforcement agency. We don't have game officers like the Department of Fish and Game. We're not state troopers, but we do try to coordinate with these agencies that have, these type of authorities to assist us when we travel to certain sites, because, we can receive a complaint about a violation and file a written report, but forcing someone to change or to address that can be very difficult. It's really hard for us to force anyone to correct a misuse. We can revoke some permits and land use authorizations, but even if we do that, that doesn't mean that the person's going to do what they need to do to come into compliance. So we have, we have a Department of Law that we can forward a lot of these misuses of state authorizations to, but whether or not they're going to have the time to look into every single one is a challenge as well. So that kind of summarizes my talk. Just to go over everything, our mission is to maximize the use of state land consistent with public interest, but doing so in a way that minimizes harm and degradation to state land. We do this through the authorization of state land through permits, easements, and leases, and other decision tools. And we use management strategies and stipulations from the comments that we receive from the public and other agencies to set these parameters around the authorization. One of the most important things that we really rely on to inform our decision making is comments, not only from agencies where they have expertise, but from the public as well. Some authorizations I won't receive any public comment on, and some I receive substantial comment on, and they really force us to think about the requested use and really evaluate, is this in the best interest of the state? How can we maximize the use? Can we authorize this activity, but in a way that helps meet, most everyone's needs and concerns? It's a really important part of the process. So if you're interested in learning more, I provided a few links up here. This is to the DNR webpage and the DMLW webpage, and then we have a great website with several fact sheets if you're interested in learning more about land management or what our division does. And if you really want to geek out and read some Alaska statutes or regulations, there's some links to that as well. All right, and so with that, I will take your questions. I'll stop
Awesome.
sharing my screen as well.
Awesome. Thanks to you both. I know we had a few questions in the chat, and maybe Rachel can help moderate that. I'd just like to ask, I know most of the issues, that I mentioned in the beginning, the Tongass, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, those are federal lands. But just, can you give us just a quick sense of what's the pulse of Alaskans' view of opening up these wilderness areas? There's the economics versus the conservation. I'm just curious what both your takes are on that.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends in the Forest Service and folks that work for the Division of Forestry, and I asked them about this and what their thoughts were. I think for the most part, people, at least in Juneau, tend to be against it. My friends that are in the Forest Service say that it doesn't really make sense, that the value of the tree isn't going to be worth the costs associated with opening the area to commercial logging, that the trees just don't hold the sort of value that will generate substantial revenue. I think that there might be a different feeling in the interior. Juneau's pretty blue, as they say, but for the most part, Alaska's a challenging state. There's a strong sense of rugged individualism, as we like to say, where people don't like to be told what they can and can't do on their land, public land, and so they want to see what they want to see done. It's a mixed bag, but I don't know what you have to say about it, Sorina.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said. I think some interesting conversations that Megan and I have been a part of with specific regards to places like Anwar. I don't know if you've picked up on this, Megan, but like a strong sense of the people from the area should be the ones in charge of deciding how that gets used, and that it should not be like influenced by conservationists from California or like the federal government who doesn't understand sort of the nuances of how Alaska works. So I think that's interesting. And we've been a part of conversations that have been very pro. This was back in Fairbanks, again, the interior, which is a very different culture and political climate, very pro opening up some of these areas for the benefit of local communities. And it's that constant balance between what development can do for some of these areas that are very resource dependent and have structured their economy to be like 90% dependent on a specific resource extraction activity. So it's just complicated because of those intricacies of supporting communities that don't have a lot else going, and not a lot of other revenue coming in.
Yeah, no, so definitely that it's kind of magnified that dichotomy, I think, in a place like Alaska. Yeah, so Rachel, do you want to monitor the chat there and get us up to speed?
Yeah, sure. I have been, and it's Megan O'Leary's up first, followed by Natasha Laird.
Hi, thank you for presenting tonight. You addressed this, I asked my question before you addressed this in your presentation, but I was just wondering, just given how big Alaska is, how do you and your team go out and make sure that everyone is following the rules, or that everyone is applying for permits and leases rather than just kind of doing whatever they want to do on the land without asking, or
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. There's a saying in my office, and it's that we regulate the willing. We really can only manage the people that, am I muted? No, sorry. The people that come to us seeking authorization. Alaska's a massive state, and so unless we hear about someone reporting a violation or reporting a cabin that's built in a remote area, or someone that's leaving material and debris on state land, there's not really a way for us to know about it. And like I said, we're not an enforcement agency. We don't have troopers. We don't have people that we can march up to and demand that they make the change immediately. We have ways to kind of scare people. We'll send them written documents saying that they're in trespass and that this is a violation of the state, it's against the law, but enforcing that is really challenging. Some of the things that we'll say is that you're accruing back fees, like but until you remove this structure from the site, you're essentially going to have to pay for it eventually, and we might forward this to the Department of Law and they'll pursue you with legal trespass charges, but how often that gets done is still kind of up in the air, it's a really big challenge, and it's kind of a frustrating part of my job, to be honest.
All right, Natasha.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us today. I guess, Megan, this is more of a question for you, and you kind of touched on it at the end. But I was just wondering how much local voices and kind of native and traditional communities are involved in the process when it comes to authorization, because obviously for Alaska, that's a huge aspect of.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So so those area plans that I was talking about, we have an entire unit. They're called the public, oh God, so many acronyms, public assessment division section. I'm screwing this up. Basically, they are the unit that's in charge of writing those area plans. And so to write one, it takes years and years, and they have to solicit substantial input from everyone within that specific area. So they'll reach out to the regional corporation, they'll reach out to the local villages, in addition to all the federal agencies and anyone else that has interest in the area, and they do a really long and broad public comment period. So I know that the people in the PADS unit will spend some significant time trying to find the traditional and local uses of the area, and they'll work with some of our other state offices to identify historical uses or other key sites to make sure that the management intent is, is appropriate for the area. And also, whenever I'm doing an authorization, we're required as part of our public notice process to contact the local regional corporation and the local Alaska Native village, and anyone else that writes to us and says, hey, we want to be noticed about any decision that you take on state land. We'll notice all of them, just to try and get and solicit as much input as we can. Like I said, it's a really big part of our process, and it does shape a lot of the decisions that we make. So it's a good question. Thanks.
Anyone else? Questions? You can, unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Any other questions for Sorina or Megan?
I have a question. It's not as dark here as it makes me look, but yeah, I'm here. So I just did a project about the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting is they kind of give Alaska Natives a pretty big exception for removing certain marine mammals from Alaska. And I think that that's cool because, you can't just tell a Native population like you can't do what you've been doing anymore. But I was just curious how you guys feel the exceptions for Alaska kind of benefit or maybe hinder environmental protections, if that makes sense. That wasn't like the most clear question ever.
No, that makes total sense. Sorina, do you want to take a stab at that, or do you want me to go first?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think the answer is that it depends on, like, co-management sort of falls under NOAA and Fish and Wildlife, and depending on the species, co-management happens in a way that's like generally very productive and good, and then with some species it's been kind of a catastrophe. So it does sort of depend a little bit on which species you're looking at. I think it's been a little while since we've been looking at this, but like my assessment and opinion of it was that, or is that the co-management, that the use of marine mammals, the subsistence hunting there's examples of when it has very drastically decreased populations, but in general is not what causes dramatic population decline. And historically, they've been very well managed. And a lot of the challenges have emerged more recently with a lot more of these regulations and rules. I'm definitely not an authority on this, but Megan and I spent some time up in Northwest Alaska in Nome, specifically talking to people about co-management, and also their opinions on partnerships with the federal government regarding management, and where they feel the challenges are. And the sentiment there too is definitely that it is not the hunting, which is, it's very well regulated, and there's good coordination among communities. And they also have like great ways of observing population dynamics, which it's also interesting because often the federal government will do like an account of bowhead whales and be like, okay, based on this count, 50 whales can be harvested this year. And then sort of indigenous groups will also do a count, and the numbers will be very different. And like, actually, sometimes they say like, actually we should be allowed to harvest 100 whales, but sometimes it goes the opposite way. And they say, no, absolutely not. Like, we should be harvesting 5. So it's certainly not like the federal government is, if it weren't there, it would just be like a free for all. Do you want to add anything, Megan?
I think that was a perfect summary, and that one of the things I was going to mention was also what you said about the differing perspectives on what is an appropriate take. A lot of the folks we talked to in Nome said exactly the example Sorina did, that they have a traditional knowledge system and traditional ways of accounting for the number of species within an area that sometimes differs vastly from what federal agencies or regulatory agencies will say is appropriate, or what's available and what's appropriate. I think for the most part, it's been an overall success. I think if you kind of look at the principles of co-management and kind of evaluate that with Eleanor Ostrom's theory of management, there's a lot of similar design principles, and it kind of is an effective, a more effective way to manage a resource.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Tomas, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for taking the time out of your day to speak with us. I was just wondering if the I forgot what you called it, the ear pack or whatever.
IRPIC, yeah.
IRPIC. If you guys ever considered like doing like more simplified like versions of your data and findings to sort of like help influence public support instead of just giving it to federal agencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've been having a lot of conversations about that. And a lot of the comments that came in, I think we received about 150 comments through the Federal Register notice, and a substantial amount of those comments were to do with communicating research back to communities and to different stakeholders in a much more understandable and simplified way, or not necessarily simplified, but just in a way that's appropriate for and usable for different sectors. So we are thinking about that for the new plan, especially with regards to community needs and the information that communities need in a very time-sensitive form. So for example, a harmful algal bloom, like communities need to know pretty quickly if there's a bloom, how that's impacting wildlife and subsistence hunting. So I think IRPIC over the course of plans has been making improvements in this direction, but I'm very encouraged to see that it's a large part of the discussions that are happening right now. And there, I think traditionally has been a lot of confusion about what IRPIC is, because again, like it's not enforcement, just like Megan's talking about. It's so how do we like it? Yeah, that's going off on a different tangent, but it's a big part of the conversation, and I'm hoping that this year will be it will be an outcome.
Nice.
Awesome, thank you.
Nice. Any other questions for Megan and Sorina? All righty. Well, look, you guys are doing awesome work up there, and now down in the lower 48 for Sorina here. But still connected with your project up there. Thank you so much. It was good to see you all. It's been a while since we've connected, and we'll keep posted. We'll definitely send any students who are interested in Alaska and Arctic work your way for maybe some info interviews or whatever. And we look forward to hearing about your latest exploits in the coming months and years. So thank you so much again, and let's everybody give a hand virtually if we can. And
Thank you.
Everyone be well, and we'll catch you all next week. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, everybody. Yep. Bye.